The sovereignty's war declaration reached humanity on a Tuesday, which Brennan thought was a rude way to start a week. He was in the Keth Diplomatic Station's secondary observation lounge when the broadcast came through, all channels, all frequencies, the kind of transmission you send when you want the message to be unmistakable. The Vel's Supreme Covenant seal rotated in the center of the holoprojector, a 12-pointed crystalline structure that caught the light like something designed specifically to be impressive. The voice that accompanied it was layered, harmonic, 4 simultaneous tones that the translation matrix rendered as one. Humanity, you have insulted the sovereignty. Your existence is hereby contested. Around Brennan, the Keth diplomatic staff moved with the controlled urgency of people who had protocols for this. Carapaces clicking, limbs retracting into defensive postures. The station's yellow emergency lighting replaced the standard blue-white in about 4 seconds. Someone was already reciting evacuation procedures in 3 languages. Brennan finished his water, set the cup down carefully on the edge of the console, and pulled out his stylus. The cause of the declaration was, by any reasonable measure, absurd. Envoy Callas had refused to perform the Vel submission rite, the full prostration, the bared throat, the waiting, because she had not known it was required, because the Vel had not told her it was required, because apparently the Vel assumed all sapient species already knew. The logic chain that connected that misunderstanding to 30 billion humans being notified of their impending extermination was long and depressing, and very, very Vel. Brennan had been on the station for 6 weeks as part of an infrastructure assessment team. He was an engineer. He assessed things. He was assessing this now. A Keth officer appeared at his elbow, smaller than the diplomatic staff, more heavily armored, with the wide-set optical clusters of their security caste. Human, you are required to accompany me for proximity assessment. What does that involve? Containment, biological monitoring, and threat response cataloging. Is there coffee involved? There is not. Brennan stood, tucked the stylus behind his ear. Let's go then. The containment suite was a polite name for a room with 1 chair, 1 table, and sensors in the ceiling that he could identify from the housing type alone. Keth biometric arrays. They would be reading his cortisol, his heart rate, his skin galvanism. They would be waiting for the threat response cascade that every sapient species demonstrated within 30 seconds of receiving news of civilizational war. He sat down, asked again about coffee, was refused again, and improvised. His ration pack had protein powder, a heating element the size of his thumb, and a sealed water bladder. He combined all 3 in the cup they'd given him for water. The result tasted like something had died in a cafeteria, but it was hot and it had caffeine analogs, and that was enough. The Keth who came to observe him was introduced, eventually, as Assessor Murath. She was of the analyst caste, narrower, with finer optical clusters than the security officer, and a thorax that shimmered faintly under the station's emergency lighting. She stood at the far end of the table with a data recorder, and looked at him the way Brennan looked at a system schematic he couldn't immediately parse. "You received the broadcast," she said. "I did. Your threat response indicators are within resting state parameters." "I know," he sipped the protein thing. "I'll process it later." Murath made a notation. Her data recorder emitted a faint sound like 2 stones touching. They transferred his personal data pad to him after the 2nd hour, standard Keth protocol, apparently, once the threat profile came back inconclusive. He pulled up the full text of the sovereignty's declaration and read it the way he read any technical document, stylus in hand, starting from the beginning. The declaration was 47 paragraphs. It outlined the specific insult, the historical precedent, the legal framework of the Vel sovereignty's right to contest, the expected timeline of operations, and the projected outcome. It was thorough. It was, in several places, tactically specific in ways that struck Brennan as either very confident or very stupid. He circled 6 things. Murath had not left. She was still at the far end of the table, still recording, and she was watching his stylus move across the data pad with an expression he couldn't read, because she didn't have a face in the way he understood faces. "What are you marking?" she asked. "Errors." A pause. The data recorder touched its stones. "You are identifying tactical errors in a war declaration directed at your species." "Someone should." He tapped the 3rd circle. "They're planning to take the outer relay network first. Standard communication disruption. It's what I do. The problem is they're projecting 60 days to consolidate before Earth can respond." He turned the pad so she could see the circled passages. "That number is wrong by about half." Murath was still for a moment that lasted slightly longer than her previous pauses. "You have military training." "I have engineering training. Same basic skill set. You look at a system, you find where it breaks." He went back to the document. "They've also underestimated load-bearing capacity on the supply corridor through the Herath expanse by about 30%. That's a logistics problem. It'll cost them 2 weeks minimum when it fails." "You seem very calm." "I'm not." He turned to page 11. "I just scheduled the part where I'm not calm for later. Right now there's work to do." Murath made 3 notations in rapid succession. He finished the document, circled 2 more things, and looked up. Outside the small viewport in the upper corner of the containment suite, they'd given him a viewport, which was either Keth courtesy or continued biometric assessment. The stars were exactly where they'd been before the broadcast. The universe had not reorganized itself in response to the Vel sovereignty's announcement. He noted this as a mildly comforting data point. "Assessor," he said, "can I ask you something?" "You may." "Has the sovereignty ever declared war on a persistence predator before?" Murath's optical clusters shifted orientation. "I am not familiar with that category." Brennan set down the data pad. "On Earth, this is deep history pre-spaceflight. The most successful hunting strategy wasn't strength or speed. It was following something until it couldn't run anymore. Walk after it for hours, days. It doesn't matter that it's faster. You just don't stop." He picked up his improvised coffee. "Humans are the only sapient species in the known catalog that evolved from pursuit predators. It shapes how we think about problems, about wars." He watched Murath process this. Her thorax shimmering had increased slightly, which he filed away as potentially significant. "You don't disengage," she said slowly. "You just continue." "We're very good at continuing," Brennan said. "It's maybe our best thing." Murath went still again for 4 full seconds. Then she made a notation that took longer than any of the others. Her first report, transmitted to the Keth High Council that evening, contained the following line: "Subject displays no survival calculus consistent with known sapient species. Recommend extended observation. Recommend also that the Council consider the historical etymology of the term persistence predator before issuing any formal response to the sovereignty's declaration on humanity's behalf." Brennan didn't know what she'd written. He was asleep in the containment suite chair, his annotated data pad on his chest, dreaming about supply corridors. The Vel's first strike took out 3 of Earth's outer relays, which was exactly what Brennan had predicted on page 1 of his notes, and he was not happy about being right. The strike happened on day 9. The Keth station received the intelligence 30 hours after the fact. The speed of light was still a limit, even for bad news, and the casualty estimate came through at the same time: 41,000 dead, mostly station personnel and the skeleton crews who hadn't evacuated in time. Brennan read the number twice. He had the same response to it both times. He was already at a table in the station's shared working area. Murath had negotiated him out of the containment suite after the first biometric review came back, and the Keth had decided a monitored desk was sufficient. With a borrowed star map and a grease pencil, he traded 3 ration bars to acquire. He was drawing supply lines. Murath arrived at 600 station time and found him there. She had been transmitting her reports consistently since the first day. She had not expected to find him working. "You received the casualty report," she said. "Yes." The Keth diplomatic staff are preparing condolence protocols. Standard form transmission to Earth's communication network. "That's kind of them." He didn't look up. "The relay network is down in 3 sectors but not 4. The 4th one, Proxima Anchor, they didn't hit it. Either they didn't know it was there or they're leaving it up on purpose." He tapped the star map. "Leaving it up on purpose doesn't make sense for a communication disruption strategy, so they didn't know." Murath's data recorder was already running. "You are doing this instead of morning." "I'm doing this before morning. Sequence matters." He looked up for the first time. 41,000 people is a real number. I'll carry it properly later. Right now it needs to mean something tactical, or it just means they're gone for nothing." Murath looked at him for a long moment. Then she made a notation marked with a different symbol than the others, one she used for things she needed to recategorize later. She had filed her initial report as emotional deficiency. She was beginning to think this was incorrect. The Vel envoy arrived at 1100. He came through the main diplomatic corridor with a security detail of 6 Vel soldiers in the multi-layered crystalline armor that their species had been wearing for 400 years, unchanged because it worked. The envoy himself was tall, even by Vel standards, with the full resonance array of a senior sovereignty official. When he spoke, the harmonics carried. "The Keth station will surrender the human asset," he said, "in Keth formal register, or the Keth station will be considered complicit in the ongoing contest." The Keth High Station coordinator was a diplomat named Irevith, and Irevith was very good at her job. And her job right now was to find a way to comply without actually complying, while determining whether compliance was politically survivable. Brennan could see her running the calculus from across the room. He stood up from his table. It was not a dramatic motion. He pushed his chair back, stood, and walked to where the diplomatic exchange was happening. He was a medium-height human male in civilian engineering clothes with a grease pencil behind one ear and ink on 2 fingers. He stood next to Irevith and looked up at the Vel envoy. "I'm the human asset," he said. "I'm also the person who's been reading your war declaration for a week." He held up the data pad with its circles and annotations. "I want to tell you how I think this ends." The envoy's resonance array shifted pitch, irritation, or something that translated as irritation. "You are in no position to." "The Earth response fleet is going to be here in 30 to 40 days, Brennan said. "Not 60 like your planners projected, 30 to 40. I've worked the logistics. When they arrive, they're not going to stop." He kept his voice level, factual, the way you describe a structural load calculation to a client. "Your supply corridor through the Herath Expanse is going to fail in the next 2 weeks, which means your frontline fleet is going to be operating on reserve capacity when they get here. I've marked that in paragraph 14 of your declaration, if you want to check my math." Silence. The harmonics in the room had gone flat. "I don't know if this ends well for Earth," Brennan continued. "I do know that your planners made 6 identifiable errors in the first document they published, and that's not a sign of a military that's going to do better when things get complicated." He lowered the data pad. "I'm telling you this not because I'm threatening you. I'm telling you because you came here to take something, and I think you should know the price before you decide it's worth paying." The envoy looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the data pad. Then he said something in primary Vel that the translation matrix rendered as approximately, "This is irregular." He left without Brennan. He took his security detail and his harmonics, and he went back through the diplomatic corridor, and Brennan went back to his table and sat down. Irevith stared at him. Murath stared at him. Everyone in the room was very still. How did you know what to say? Murreth asked. Brennan picked up his grease pencil. I didn't. I just knew they needed to hear it. He went back to the supply corridors. Murreth stood at the edge of his table for a while before she opened her data recorder and began writing the longest report she'd sent yet. The Sovereignty's second wave arrived 17 days early, which meant Brennan had been wrong about one thing. He found out about the early arrival because the station's sensors lit up at 3:40, and Murreth came to get him personally, which was not standard Keth protocol for anything except situations where standard Keth protocol had been suspended. She moved fast for someone with 6 limbs, and she knocked on the door of his quarters with 3 of them simultaneously. Strike force, she said when he opened it. FTL emergence point, the neutral zone bearing 227 by 40, 11 vessels. They are targeting the communications array. Brennan was already dressed. He'd been sleeping in his clothes since day 3, on the theory that a person who had to put on shoes when an emergency happened was a person who had not properly assessed the situation. He had his data pad and his toolkit, and he was moving before Murreth finished the sentence. The communications array was in the station's secondary infrastructure ring, behind 3 bulkheads, and through a cargo bay that smelled like Keth agricultural exports. The array itself was a standard deep space relay amplifier. He'd read the specs in the first week, force of habit, with a civilian-grade power coupling that would be the first thing to go under any sustained weapon signature. How long before they're in range? He said, walking fast. 41 minutes at their current approach vector. What do we have in the cargo bay? Murreth's optical clusters shifted in a way he'd learned to read as confusion. Agricultural shipment, cooling units, spare parts inventory for. What kind of spare parts? She pulled up the cargo manifest on her data recorder. He reached over and scrolled it himself, faster than she'd been navigating it. Cooling units, yes. Also 3 industrial capacitors rated for heavy equipment, a spool of high-tensile signal wire, and 2 power regulators from a Keth mining platform that were sitting in the bay because someone had misfiled the shipping documents. That works, he said. That works for what? For building a signal amplifier that'll push one burst through before the array goes down. He pushed through the second bulkhead. It won't be pretty. It'll work once, but once is enough if I put the right things in the burst. Murreth kept pace with him, which meant she was moving faster than was comfortable for her. He noted this without comment. The VEL will detect increased power draw on the array. Yes. They will accelerate their approach. Probably. This will reduce your available time. I know. He hit the cargo bay door. That's why I'm moving fast instead of slow. The cargo bay was dim, climate-controlled for the agricultural shipment, which meant it was cold enough that his breath fogged. He found the capacitors by their housing color, yellow and black, standard heavy equipment marking, and the signal wire on the second shelf of the parts inventory, and he was already thinking through the connection sequence before he had all 3 pieces in front of him. He worked the way he always worked, out loud, but not for company. Power draw through the capacitors to bypass the coupling fault, signal wire as the secondary pathway, need to strip about 2 meters of casing, regulators in series to step down the voltage before it hits the array transmitter, or I'll blow the transmitter instead of the capacitors. I can hold those, Murreth said. He glanced at her. She had extended 2 of her secondary limbs toward the capacitors. Her optical clusters were tracking his hands. 4 centimeters apart, he said. Hold them steady. She held them steady. He stripped the signal wire with his teeth and a folding knife, and she didn't say anything about the teeth part, which he appreciated. 23 minutes in, the hull of the cargo bay registered an impact, not a weapons hit, a proximity shockwave from a vessel moving at high speed in the neutral zone, which the VEL had already violated twice now. The shockwave rattled the cooling units and knocked two of the misfiled power regulators off their shelf. Brennan caught one. The other hit the deck and he left it. "One regulator," he said. "Is that sufficient?" "I'll find out." He rewired the step-down sequence in his head, ran the math on the voltage difference, found an acceptable margin of error. "It's sufficient." 14 minutes later, he sealed the last connection with emergency foam from a wall cabinet. The foam was rated for hull breaches, but the conductivity was close enough. Close enough. He'd done worse with less on the Meridian Station refit 2 years ago and stood up. "I need a data burst prepared," he said. "Everything we have. Fleet positions, supply corridor status, the early arrival time, the neutral zone violation. All of it." Murath was already on her data recorder. "Ready." "On my mark." He powered the capacitors. The array transmitter hummed in a way that the specs said was normal, and his instincts said was too high. But his instincts were working with one regulator instead of two, and the math said sufficient. The math said sufficient. "Mark," he said. The burst went out. He sat down on the deck. The cargo bay floor was cold through his clothes, and he didn't care. His hands were on his knees and they were shaking, a fine motor tremor, not gross motor, which meant adrenaline and not structural damage, and he looked at them with the same attention he'd given the capacitor connections. "Signal confirmed," Murath said. "Burst received at the Proxima anchor." A pause. "They are relaying to Earth." "Good." She looked at him. Her optical clusters were very still. "Your hands." "I know." "You continued working while." "I know." She made a notation. Then she was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than her usual pauses. "Is this normal for your species?" Brennan watched his hands slow down. The tremor decreased by maybe 30% over the next 40 seconds, and he tracked it the way you'd track a pressure reading coming back to nominal. "More or less," he said. "The body runs the emergency protocol, and then it sends you the bill when you're done. And you continue to work during the billing period. You can't really stop it by paying attention to it." He flexed his fingers, checking the fine motor function. "Normal, so you just note it and keep going." He sat on the cold floor for another minute. Outside the cargo bay hull, somewhere in the dark, the Vel strike force was doing whatever Vel strike forces did after their primary objective had been partially defeated by one human and one Keth analyst with 2 capacitors and a spool of wire. "There it is," he said, mostly to himself. "Pardon." "The part I scheduled for later." He looked at his hands. Apparently it didn't wait. Murath stood very still. Then she opened her data recorder and created a new category header, the 7th she'd created since the containment suite, and began writing in it. She wrote for 3 minutes without stopping. She did not explain to Brennan what the category was called. He did not ask. Earth's response fleet arrived in 31 days, which was 20 days faster than any Keth tactical model had projected, and 9 days faster than Brennan's. He watched them come in on the station's sensor array, 114 vessels, which was not the largest fleet humanity had ever assembled but was assembled fast, which was the point. They dropped out of FTL in a dispersal pattern that the Keth tactical analysts described in their reports as aggressive. Brennan would have called it efficient. The distinction was probably cultural. The Vel Sovereignty Fleet had 31 ships in the sector. They had been operating on reserve capacity for 11 days. The Herath Expanse supply corridor had failed on day 19, 2 days later than Brennan's estimate, which he counted as a rounding error. The Vel were not, by any measure, in a strong position. They fought anyway. He gave them that. The engagement lasted 6 hours on sensors. It did not look like the tactical simulations he'd reviewed in the station's library database. Those were clean, vector-diagrammed ships moving in logical formations toward logical objectives. What the sensors showed was something less organized and more relentless. The human fleet absorbed losses and kept moving. Brennan watched one of the tactical feeds where a carrier took a full Vel weapons signature in its forward section and continued on its approach vector, leaking atmosphere, closing the distance. Murath was standing next to him. She had been standing next to him for most of the past 9 days, filing reports that she no longer showed him but that he suspected were getting longer. She watched the tactical feeds with her data recorder running. "They are still advancing," she said. "The carrier with the hull breach." "Yes. They could withdraw to a repair position." "They could. Why aren't they?" Brennan thought about how to answer this. Because withdrawing to a repair position means the ship in front of them has to cover more distance alone, and they'd rather have a hull breach than make that ship cover the distance alone. Murath made a notation, pack behavior. Something like that. He watched the carrier close the last kilometer. It's not entirely rational. "No," Murath said, "it is not." The Vel flagship signaled for negotiation at hour 7. The signal came through on the General Diplomatic Channel, which meant it also went to the Keth High Council, which meant that within 4 minutes Ireveth was at Brennan's elbow with the expression of someone who was about to ask him to do something that wasn't in any protocol she'd ever trained for. "You are," she said carefully, "the only human within communication range with diplomatic proximity. I'm an engineer. You are currently the human asset," she said, with the most contextual understanding of the situation. "I've been awake for 60 hours. "Yes," Ireveth said, "I am aware." Brennan rubbed his face with both hands. His eyes felt like they had been sandpapered on the inside. He had been running on protein powder coffee and stubbornness for 9 days, and the stubbornness was holding up better than the coffee supply. "Open the channel," he said. The Vel Supreme Commander's harmonics came through the translation matrix at a lower register than the envoys had been, older or more controlled or both. The sovereignty seal rotated in the holoprojector again, 12 points, catching the light. "We propose terms," the commander said. "Cessation of hostilities, withdrawal to pre-engagement positions, reparations scheduled to be negotiated." Brennan looked at the proposed terms on the secondary screen. They were in his hands within 20 seconds. Murath had pulled them up before he asked, which was something she'd started doing around day 4 and which he'd stopped remarking on. He read for a minute. He circled 4 things. "Your withdrawal timeline is 9 days, he said. "Your fleet is operating on reserve capacity. 9 days is too long. Your forward vessels will run critical on supply before they reach your withdrawal point." He underlined the relevant clause on the secondary screen. "You need 15 days or the ceasefire breaks down on day 10 when your ships start going dark, and then we're back to contact. I don't think either of us wants that." A pause from the sovereignty commander, longer than the pauses Brennan was used to. "You are correcting our ceasefire terms," the commander said. "I'm fixing a logistics error in your ceasefire terms. There's a difference." Another pause. "Why would you fix this?" Brennan thought about 41,000 people, and the star map with supply corridors and his hands shaking on the cargo bay floor, and the carrier with the hull breach that kept moving anyway. He thought about the part he'd scheduled for later, which was not later yet, which would be later soon. "Because if the ceasefire fails on a logistics error, the war starts again," he said. "And I don't want the war to start again. I want it to stop." He looked at the circled clauses. "I want it to stop so much that I'll fix your paperwork to make it happen." The commander's harmonics shifted. Brennan didn't have enough experience with Vel vocal registers to name what the shift indicated. It might have been confusion. It might have been something that didn't have a name in any language he spoke. "The 15-day withdrawal is acceptable," the commander said. "Good. I'm also going to need the sovereignty to formally acknowledge the neutral zone violations. 2 documented incidents. Dates and vessel registrations are in your own logs. because the Keth need that on record, and frankly so do we. There was a longer pause this time, then acknowledged. Good, he was very tired. Then we're done here. The ceasefire transmission took 11 minutes to formalize. Brennan signed the human acknowledgement with his engineering credentials because he didn't have anything else, and the sovereignty commander signed with the full weight of the Vel sovereignty's legal apparatus, and Mureth documented everything with her data recorder, while Ireveth stood behind them both and did not say a word about the irregular nature of any of it. Brennan transmitted the signed document to Earth's Fleet Command, and then to Earth's government, and then to the Proxima Anchor relay for distribution. He watched the transmission confirmations come back one by one on the secondary screen. Then he put his head down on the console and he went to sleep. He did not intend to fall asleep. He intended to rest for a moment, to close his eyes for 60 seconds, to let the 60 hours of wait set down briefly before he picked it back up. The intention did not survive contact with the reality of having 60 hours of wait to set down. He did not hear Mureth open the emergency kit from the cabinet near the communications array. He did not feel her unfold the thermal sheet, standard Keth emergency equipment, rated for 3 body temperatures below minimum sapient survivable range, which was a very wide standard, and lay it over his shoulders with the care of someone performing an action they had no institutional framework for. He did not see her dim the lights in the communications room. Her final report to the Keth High Council, transmitted at 2:14 station time, contained one paragraph that her supervisors would later flag for clarification and never fully receive it. I do not have a category for what I observed over the past 31 days. The subject did not behave according to any established sapient stress response model. He scheduled his fear. He fixed the enemy's paperwork. He shook and kept working. I have been creating new taxonomy categories for 17 days, and I am not finished. I am recommending the creation of a permanent research designation. I am also, for reasons I find difficult to articulate in formal reporting language, recommending that the subject be allowed to sleep undisturbed. Outside the viewport, the human fleet held position in the dark. The engagement was over. The ships did not disperse. They did not power down. They sat in the silence between stars the way the species always had, waiting without apparent distress for whatever the galaxy decided to send next. Mureth stood at the viewport for a long time. She did not have a category for what she felt, watching them. She created one.